Forest mysteries.
The car lurched over the last rut and stopped in a spray of gravel. Jack Mercer killed the engine and stared through the dusty windshield at the house. It sat at the edge of a Vermont forest like something the trees had tried to swallow and then given up on. The roof sagged in the middle. The porch leaned a little to the left. Gray paint peeled away in curls, and one shutter hung by a single nail. Well, Jack said, it's got character. Laura Mercer unbuckled her seatbelt and pressed her face to the window. The air outside was damp and cold for late May, and the forest behind the house was a solid wall of pine and birch. She could hear a bird she didn't recognize, a low repeating whistle that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It's beautiful, she said. It's a lot of work, Jack said. Did the listing mention the shutter? The listing was honest about the bones. Laura opened the door and stepped out. Her boots sank into soft ground. The smell hit our first wet wood, pine needles, and something older, like a cellar that hadn't breathed in years. They unloaded the car in silence. Jack carried the cooler. Laura took a box of linens and a flashlight. The front door opened with a groan, and inside the air was still and heavy. Dust floated in the thin light from the windows. The floors were wide pine boards, dark with age, and every step sent a creak through the frame of the house. They walked from room to room, naming things they would fix. The kitchen needed new countertops. The bedroom had a crack in the ceiling that would need taping. Laura opened the back door that led to the enclosed porch, and that was when she heard it. A thin, high whimper, like a puppy, but not quite. Jack, she said. He came up behind her, still holding the cooler. What? Listen. They stood in the doorway and let the silence settle. The sound came again, a tiny, breathy whine, muffled by wood. It came from underneath the porch floor. Jack set the cooler down. He pulled his phone from his pocket, switched on the light, and stepped onto the porch. The boards complained under his weight. Laura followed, her heart beating faster than it should. The lattice that skirted the porch was old and broken in places, but the sound was coming from a spot where the boards met the house wall. Jack crouched and played the light over the gap. The beam caught a shimmer of movement, small pale shapes squirming in a hollow of pressed grass and gray fur. Laura knelt beside him and peered into the dark. 5 tiny bodies, eyes still milky blue, their coats a mess of brown and gray fuzz. They were piled together for warmth, their ribsages rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. What are they? She whispered, though she already knew. Wolf cubs, Jack said. His voice was flat, right under the porch. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Laura felt something twist in her chest, not fear, not yet, something closer to astonishment. These wild secret things had been living here while the house sat empty, and now she was looking at them, breathing the same air. Jack stood up and rubbed the back of his neck. I'm calling a game warden first thing tomorrow. Tomorrow, Laura stayed on her knees, her eyes still on the cubs. Can't we just wait? Maybe the mother will move them. The mother is a full-grown wolf, Laura. She's not going to move them because we ask nicely. Jack's voice had the edge he used when a work project went sideways. She'll come back. She'll see us as a threat. Laura touched a fingertip to the old wood. One of the cubs shifted and let out a tiny grunt. She pulled her hand back. They're so small. They're wild animals, Jack said, not pets. I know they're not pets. Laura finally stood. Her knees ached from the hard boards, but this is their home too. We just got here. It's our house. We paid for it. Jack's jaw was tight. We can't live with a wolf den under the floor. He turned and went back inside, his footsteps heavy on the porch. Laura lingered a moment longer. The whining had stopped. The cubs had fallen back into their pile, oblivious. She could hear the forest again, the bird with its low whistle, the rustle of wind in the pines. That night, they made up the mattress on the floor of the least dusty room. The power was on, but the only working bulb was in the kitchen, so they lit a candle and set it on a crate. The flame threw long shadows on the walls. They ate cold sandwiches from the cooler and didn't talk much. Jack checked his phone repeatedly, walking from window to window to find a bar of signal. There was none inside the house. Finally, he went out to the car and made the call to the ranger station from the driveway. When he came back, his face was unreadable. Left a message, he said. They'll call back. Laura nodded and pulled the blanket up to her chin. The candle flickered. Outside, the wind had picked up and the old house sighed around them. Jack fell asleep quickly, his breathing steady and deep. Laura lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle. Every creak mate or think of the mother wolf, padding soft-footed through the dark, looking for her litter. She imagined yellow eyes catching the moonlight, a gray shape moving between the trees. She thought about what Jack had said. Wild animals, not pets. He was right, of course, but the image stayed with her, the tiny ribsages, the blind blue eyes. They hadn't asked to be born under a human porch. They had just been there, waiting for their mother to come back. If we scare her, what will she do? The question circled in her mind like the bird's whistle in the woods. She didn't have an answer. She didn't share the thought with Jack. Somewhere far out in the forest, a sound lifted into the night. A long, low howl, then another. Laura held her breath. The candle had burned down to a puddle of wax. She listened until the howls faded and only the wind was left, and still she did not sleep. The storm rolled in just after midnight. The first gust shook the house, and rain slammed against the windows like a fistful of gravel. Laura jolted upright, her heart punching against her ribs. The candle had gone out. The room was black. Beside her, Jack stirred and mumbled something. A crack of lightning bleached the walls white for a split second, and then the thunder came, a deep boom that rattled the loose shutter outside. "Power's out," Jack said, his voice thick with sleep. He fumbled for his phone and turned on the light. The beams swept the room, picking out the boxes, the bare walls, the mattress on the floor. "I'll check the fuse box." He pulled on his jeans and left the room, taking the light with him. Laura sat in the dark, the blanket pulled around her shoulders. The rain was so loud she couldn't hear the forest anymore. She could only hear water on the roof, water against the glass, the groan of old wood settling. Jack came back a few minutes later. Not the fuse, whole area is down, probably a tree on a line. He sat on the edge of the mattress and rubbed his face. "We've got the cooler. Food's fine for now." "What about the cubs?" The words were out before Laura could stop them. Jack looked at her, his face half lit by the phone screen. What about them? The cold, the rain. She knew she was pushing, but the thought of those tiny bodies under the porch, soaked and shivering, was suddenly unbearable. "Maybe we should check. The porch is covered. They're under the house. They'll be fine." Jack's voice was patient, but there was a warning underneath. "They're built for this, Laura. It's what wild things do." She nodded and lay back down, but sleep didn't come. Jack's breathing evened out after a while, his phone still clutched in his hand. Laura listened to the storm, to the rhythm of his breath, and to the small, persistent voice in the back of her mind. "They're hungry. The mother hasn't been back since we arrived." She waited until she was sure Jack was deep asleep. Then she slipped out from under the blanket, moving as quietly as she could. The floor was cold under her bare feet. She felt her way along the wall to the kitchen, where the cooler sat on the counter. The lid opened with a soft suck of air. Inside, among the wrapped cheese and the carton of eggs, she found the package of ground beef they'd bought for their first real dinner. Her hands worked without thinking. She peeled back the plastic and pinched off a small ball of raw meat. It was cold and sticky against her fingers. She made 5 more, cradling them in her palm-like bruised fruit. The back door opened onto the porch with a sound that seemed louder than the thunder had been. Laura froze, listening for Jack, but the only answer was the rain. She stepped out. The porch was dry under the roof, but the wind drove the cold into her skin. She crouched by the gap in the floorboards where they had found the cubs. The hollow was dark. She could just make out the shape of them, piled together in the corner of their nest. One of them lifted its head and let out a tiny whine. "SHH," she whispered. "It's all right." She pushed a piece of meat through the gap in the lattice. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a wet nose appeared, sniffing. A small pink tongue darted out and licked the offering. The cub nosed the meat, then gingerly took it into its mouth. Laura fed them one by one, pushing the bits of mince through the narrow space. A tiny tongue licked her fingertip. The touch was warm and rough and impossibly gentle. Her throat tightened. When the meat was gone, she sat back on her heels. The rain was beginning to ease. The thunder had moved off to the east, a low rumble now instead of a crack. She should go back inside. She should wash her hands and lie down and pretend she hadn't done this. She turned to stand, and then she saw them. Two eyes, yellow-green, shining at the tree line 30 yards away. They were perfectly still, waist high above the ground. The lightning had stopped, but some faint glow from the clouds caught the shape behind the eyes, a long, lean body, gray fur slicked with rain, a head held low and watchful. The mother wolf. Laura's breath stopped. Her legs wouldn't move. The wolf didn't blink. She simply stood there, rain dripping from her muzzle, her gaze fixed on the woman crouched by her den. The moment stretched. Laura's mind raced through everything she knew about wolves' hunting instincts, territorial attacks, the stories her grandfather used to tell, but the wolf didn't growl. She didn't move forward. She just watched, her eyes holding a question Laura couldn't read. Slowly, Laura lowered her gaze. She made herself small. She backed toward the door, one careful step at a time, her heart beating so hard you could hear it in her ears. The wolf remained at the tree line, a ghost in the rain. Her hand found the door frame. She slid inside and closed the door as quietly as she could. Only then did she let herself breathe. She stood in the dark kitchen, her hands shaking, the smell of raw meat still on her fingers. She washed her hands in cold water from the tap, scrubbing until the smell was gone. Then she crept back to the mattress and lay down beside Jack. He hadn't moved. She stared at the ceiling until the rain stopped, and then she stared at the gray light that crept in around the edges of the curtains. She did not tell Jack what she had done. She did not tell him about the eyes at the tree line. The secret sat in her chest like a stone, heavy and cold and somehow, strangely, alive. Morning came gray and rinsed clean. The storm had moved east, leaving the ground soft and the air smelling of wet pine and turned earth. Jack was the first one outside. He stood on the porch with a mug of instant coffee, the steam curling into the cold, and looked down. Then he stopped moving entirely. The mud around the house was printed with tracks, not the small scattered marks of a raccoon or a fox. These were white as his spread hand, deep and deliberate. The toes were distinct, each one pressed hard into the soil, and the claws had left sharp punctures at the tips. They circled the porch in a loose ring, lapped around the side of the house, and disappeared into the tree line. "Laura," he called. His voice was too tight. She came to the door, still wrapped in the blanket from the mattress. When she saw the tracks, the color left her face. She had known the wolf was there. She had seen the eyes in the rain, but seeing the evidence in daylight was different. The tracks were a map of intention. The wolf had not passed through. She had circled. She had assessed. "Jesus," Laura said. Jack set his mug down on the railing. "She was right here. All night. We slept through it." He walked the perimeter of the house, following the prints. Laura stayed on the porch, hugging the blanket. She thought about the meat she had pushed through the lattice. She thought about the tiny tongue on her finger. She had done this. She had given the wolf a reason to come closer. A voice cut through the morning quiet. "You'll be the new ones then." They both turned. An old woman stood at the edge of the driveway, a walking stick in one hand and a canvas bag in the other. She wore a wax jacket and rubber boots, and her gray hair was pulled back in a tight braid. Her face was seamed and weathered, but her eyes were sharp and bright. "I'm Elsie Thompson," she said. "I live about a mile up the road. Saw your car yesterday." She walked toward them, her boots squelching in the mud. When she reached the porch, she looked down at the tracks and stopped. Her expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted. "Well now," she said, "you've got a visitor." "We found cubs under the porch," Jack said. "Last night. A litter." Elsie nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. "She'll defend what's hers. You're in her larder now." She tapped her stick on the porch step. "This house sat empty for 3 years. She got used to it." "We're calling a game warden," Jack said. Elsie's mouth pressed into a thin line. "That's your right, but understand that she's not looking for trouble. She's looking for a safe place to raise her young. You move too fast, you might make trouble where there wasn't any. Laura felt the secret pulse in her chest. She didn't look at Jack. She watched Elsie's face, the calm certainty there. The old woman spoke about the wolf the way someone might speak about a difficult neighbor, annoying, maybe, but not evil. Do they come close? Laura asked. To people, I mean. Elsie considered the question. Only if they've got a reason. Food left out. Curiosity. She's been watching you since you arrived, most likely. Deciding what you are. The words landed like a stone in still water. Laura's stomach tightened. She had given the wolf a reason. She had put meat through the gap, and the wolf had watched her do it. Jack walked back to the porch, his boots caked with mud. I'm driving to the ranger station as soon as the road dries out. This isn't something we can manage on our own. Jack, Laura said, and her voice came out softer than she intended. Can we wait just one more day? The road's a mess anyway. You saw the ruts. Why would we wait? She searched for an answer that wasn't a lie. To watch, to see what she does. Maybe she'll move them on her own if we don't bother her. If we bring someone in, it might spook her. It might make things worse. Jack looked at her for a long moment. She could feel the weight of his suspicion, but he didn't voice it. The road was bad. That was true enough. One day he said finally, if nothing changes by tomorrow morning, I'm making the call. 2 days, Laura said. Give her a real chance. The silence stretched. Elsie watched them both, her hand resting on her stick, her face unreadable. 2 days, Jack agreed, the words grudging. And then we're done. Elsie nodded once, as if something had been settled. She reached into her canvas bag and pulled out a small jar of honey, golden and thick. Welcome to the neighborhood, she said, and set it on the porch step. Then she turned and walked back up the driveway, her stick tapping a slow rhythm on the wet ground. Laura watched her go. The jar of honey sat on the step, bright as amber. She picked it up. It was warm from Elsie's bag. That afternoon, while Jack was in the house unpacking tools, Laura went back to the porch. She knelt by the gap in the boards and looked down into the hollow. The cubs were awake, their blue eyes a little less milky than the day before. They tumbled over each other, nipping at ears and tails. The mince from last night was gone. In its place, just outside the lattice where she could see it clearly, something new had been left. A rabbit skull, picked perfectly clean, the bone white and delicate. It was arranged facing the house, as if something had set it there with purpose. Laura didn't touch it. She stared at it for a long time, her heart beating hard. It wasn't a threat. She was almost sure of that. It was a message, and she didn't know how to read it, but she understood one thing with sudden, terrifying clarity. The wolf was answering her. Jack spent the afternoon rigging a trail camera under the porch. He had found it in one of the moving boxes, a leftover from a backcountry trip he had taken years ago. The camera was a small black box with an infrared sensor and a strap meant for a tree trunk. He secured it to one of the porch supports, angling the lens toward the hollow where the cubs nested. This way we'll know what we're dealing with, he said. Evidence. Laura watched from the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a cup of cold tea. The camera bothered her. It felt like a snitch, a mechanical eye that would see everything she had been doing in the dark. She had fed the cubs again the night before, slipping out while Jack slept, pushing more mince through the lattice. The mother had not appeared that time, but Laura had felt her presence, a weight in the darkness just beyond the tree line. She said nothing while Jack tested the camera. The red light blinked once, twice, and then went dark. Motion activated, he said, straightening up. It'll catch anything that moves. That night, Laura lay awake long after Jack's breathing had slowed. She wanted to go to the cubs. The pull was almost physical. A thread tied somewhere behind her ribs, but the camera was out there, its blind eye pointed at the hollow. If she went now, it would capture her. Jack would know. So she stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, the blanket pulled to her chin. The house creaked. The forest was quiet. She imagined the cubs waiting, their small bodies pressed together, their milky eyes searching the dark for a mother who might not come. When she finally slept, her dreams were full of yellow eyes. In the morning, Jack brought the camera inside and plugged it into his laptop. Laura stood behind him, her arms crossed, her stomach knotted. The footage loaded in a grid of thumbnail images. Jack clicked the first one. The screen showed the hollow under the porch, lit in gray and green by the infrared. The cubs slept in their pile, twitching occasionally. Then, at 2:14 a.m., a shadow detached itself from the darker shadow of the house wall. A human shape crouched low, Laura's silhouette. Jack didn't say anything. He clicked to the next clip, Laura's hand reaching through the lattice. The meat pressed into the hollow, the cubs stirring, nosing forward. Her face, half lit by the faint glow of the sensor, her expression soft and focused and utterly unguarded. He clicked again. More clips, all the same. Laura, night after night, feeding the wild. The silence in the kitchen was worse than shouting. Jack turned in his chair and looked at her. His face was tight, the muscle in his jaw working. "You've been feeding them," he said. "You lied." Laura opened her mouth. The excuses were there. She had wanted to help. She had thought it would keep them quiet. She had been afraid the mother wasn't coming back, but none of them felt true enough to say out loud. "I didn't know how to tell you," she said finally. "You would have stopped me." "Damn right, I would have stopped you." Jack stood up so fast the chair scraped across the floor. "Do you understand what you've done? You've trained them to associate people with food. You've given that wolf a reason to come back, again and again." "She was already coming back," Laura said. Her voice was shaking now, but she didn't look away. "She was here before I ever fed them. I saw her the first night in the rain. She was watching us. She just wanted to know what we were." "And what are we now?" "Her suppliers." Jack ran his hands through his hair. "We had a plan. 2 days, we agreed." "I know. But you didn't stick to it. You went behind my back." Laura felt the guilt rise up like heat in her throat. But underneath it, something else was burning, a small, stubborn defiance. The wolf had left her a gift. The wolf had looked at her through the rain and not attacked. She had been doing something foolish, maybe, but she hadn't been wrong about everything. "The cubs are less scared now," she said quietly. "They're not starving. The mother hasn't abandoned them." "That's not the point." Jack was already reaching for the landline phone on the counter. The old rotary dial clattered under his fingers. "I'm calling the warden. Now, this ends today." He dialed. Laura stood frozen, listening to the distant ring on the other end. Someone picked up. Jack's voice was strained but controlled as he explained the situation, the litter, the feeding, the fear. She heard him say immediate removal, and something inside her flinched. He hung up. The kitchen settled back into quiet. "Daniels is coming tomorrow," Jack said. "No more waiting." Laura didn't argue. She couldn't. The damage was done. Then the laptop chirped. A small notification popped up on the screen, motion detected. The camera was still running, still watching the hollow. Jack frowned and clicked the new file. The timestamp read 4:12 a.m. Earlier that morning. The footage was dark, the cubs asleep. Then a shape moved into the frame, not human, not small. The mother wolf, her gray coat ghostly in the infrared, her head low. She did not approach the den opening. She walked past it, deliberate and unhurried, and stopped at the back door of the house. The door Laura had used every night. She stood there for 6 minutes. The camera recorded every second. She pressed her nose to the wood. She breathed against it, her breath fogging the lens in pale clouds. Then, as quietly as she had come, she turned and padded away into the trees. Jack rewound the clip and watched it again. Then, a third time, his face had gone pale. "She knows," he said. "She knows you were the one." They woke early on the day Officer Daniels was supposed to arrive. The sky was a pale scrubbed blue, and the air had a crisp edge that promised no more rain. Jack made coffee on the camp stove. The power had flickered back on the night before, but the kitchen wiring was still a gamble. Laura stood at the back door, staring through the small window at the tree line. She had hardly slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the infrared footage, the wolf breathing against the door, patient as stone. Jack handed her a mug without meeting her eyes. The anger from the night before had cooled into something harder, a quiet, brittle distance. They moved around each other like strangers sharing a waiting room. "I'll check the road," Jack said. "Make sure it's passable for his truck." He pulled on his jacket and went out the front. Laura heard his boots on the gravel, then a sudden stop. "Laura." She set her mug down and walked to the front door. Jack stood frozen on the top step, staring at the worn wooden slats of the doormat. A dead squirrel lay exactly in the center, its body arranged with an almost ceremonial neatness. The fur was unbroken, the eyes closed. No blood, no torn flesh. Just a small, perfect body, fresh enough that the morning sun had not yet stolen its warmth. Laura's stomach turned. She had read about cats leaving offerings, but this was not a cat. The wolf had come to the door again. This time, she had left something. "Is it a warning?" Laura asked. Her voice came out thin. Jack crouched, studying the squirrel without touching it. "I don't know what it is. There are no tracks around it." Nothing. He was right. The mud around the step was smooth, untouched except for their own footprints from the night before. The squirrel had been placed there as if by a hand that left no mark. The impossibility of it made Laura's skin prickle. Jack stood and wiped his palms on his jeans. His face was pale, and she saw something she rarely saw in him, a crack in the certainty. He had a plan for everything: budgets, timelines, emergency protocols, but the woods kept rewriting the rules. The wolf had become something he could not predict, and that frightened him more than teeth ever could. "She was here while we were asleep," Laura said, "right outside." "I know." Jack's voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know what she wants." They ate breakfast in silence. Jack called the ranger station from the landline to confirm the appointment, but the call went to voicemail again. He left another message, his voice clipped and professional, but Laura could hear the strain underneath. The callback came an hour later. Jack answered on the first ring. Laura watched his face as he listened. His shoulders, which had been braced for action, sagged. "Understood," he said into the phone. "We'll be here." He hung up. His truck broke an axle on a back road near Stowe. "He can't get here until tomorrow." The words landed like a door slamming shut. Another 24 hours. Another night with the cubs under the floor. Another night with the wolf circling. Another night of not knowing whether the next gift would be fur or a warning. Jack went to the tool shed and came back with a hammer, a box of nails, and 2 wide planks of pine. "I'm sealing the porch access," he said. "The whole lattice. Nothing gets in or out." Laura stepped into his path. "Jack, don't." She came to her door. "She left a dead animal on our doorstep. If you block her from the den, she'll find another way." Laura's voice was steady, but her heart was hammering. "She might try to get inside, into the house." Jack stopped, the hammer hanging at his side. He looked at the boards, then at the porch, then at the forest. The silence stretched thin. Laura could almost see the pictures moving behind his eyes: a desperate mother, a blocked entry, a dark house with old loose windows. "The lattice is all that separates her from us right now," Laura said. "She knows where the cubs are. She knows she can reach them. If we take that away, she'll come looking." Slowly, Jack set the planks down against the porch railing. He didn't agree out loud, but he didn't nail them up either. That evening, just as the sun dipped below the tree line and the shadows pooled deep around the house, Laura heard a new sound from under the porch. The cubs were crying, but their voices had changed. The thin kittenish mewling was gone. In its place came a deeper, throatier whine that rose and fell in clumsy, unpracticed cadences, almost a howl. She stood on the porch, one hand pressed to the cold wall, listening. The cubs tried again, their small voices braiding together into something that was not yet a song, but wanted to be. From the deep woods, an answer came. A single rolling howl, low as thunder, carrying through the trees like a current through water. The house seemed to hum with it. Laura felt the vibration in her chest, in her teeth. Jack came to the door behind her. He didn't speak. They stood together in the falling dark, listening to the conversation between the cubs and their mother, a language they could not understand but could feel in their bones. The next morning, Laura made a decision she did not fully understand. She needed to see the cubs one last time. Not to feed them, she had stopped that after the camera, too frightened of what she might be shaping. But she wanted to see them in daylight, to fix the image in her memory before the warden came and took it all apart. The sun was high and warm, the kind of late spring afternoon that made the forest feel gentle. Jack was in the shed, sorting tools, his movements slow and deliberate. She could hear the clink of metal, the scrape of a shovel. She walked out onto the porch, her shadow falling long across the boards. She knelt by the gap in the lattice and peered into the hollow. The cubs were there, bigger now, their baby fuzz giving way to grizzled gray-brown coats. Their eyes had cleared to a pale amber. One of them yawned, showing tiny white needles of teeth. Another scratched behind its ear with a hind leg that seemed too large for its body. Laura smiled. She let herself forget for just a moment the fear of the last days. They were beautiful. They were wild and unfinished and absolutely of this place. Then the light changed. A shadow moved at the edge of her vision, and the air shifted a pressure, a weight. She turned her head slowly, her heart already racing before her eyes found the source. The mother wolf stood at the corner of the porch, not 30 feet away. She was larger than Laura had imagined from the glimpses in the rain and the infrared. Her coat was a thick layered gray, rough along the shoulders, paler at the muzzle. Her legs were long and lean, and her eyes were the yellow-green of lichen on stone. There was only the lattice screen between them. Laura could see the individual whiskers on the wolf's snout. She could smell her, a sour, earthy scent like wet leaves and old meat and something else, something clean and sharp as pine sap. Laura's body went still before her mind caught up. Her breath stopped. Her hands, resting on the porch boards, curled into fists. Every instinct screamed at or to run, to break eye contact, to make herself small and unthreatening, but she could not move. The wolf did not snarl. She did not raise her hackles. She simply stood there, her head low, her gaze steady and unblinking. She was assessing, weighing. Laura felt the evaluation like a physical thing, a beam of light passing through her. In that long, suspended moment, Laura understood something that words could never have captured. She was not special. The wolf was not curious about her, not grateful, not angry. She was simply a variable, a shape in the landscape that had given food and kept a strange, quiet distance. The wolf was looking at her the way she might look at a fallen tree or a new scent on the wind. Something to be read, not worshipped or feared. The humility of it hit Laura harder than terror ever could. She had wanted the wolf to be a story. She had wanted a connection, a secret bridge between the wild and herself. But the wolf had no stories. She had pups and hunger and a den that no longer felt safe. Laura was just part of the equation. The wolf blinked. She turned her head, slow and deliberate, and looked back at the forest. Then she padded away into the undergrowth, her gray body dissolving into the shadows, as if she had never been there at all. Laura collapsed against the doorframe. Her legs had turned to water. She pressed her forehead to the wood and let the sobs come, silent and shaking. She did not know why she was crying. Relief, maybe, or grief for something she had lost before she could name it. Jack found her there, slumped on the porch floor, her face wet. He knelt beside her, his hand on her shoulder. What happened? His voice was urgent, but she heard him trying to steady it for her. She was here, Laura managed. The wolf, right there. She just looked at me and left. Jack's grip tightened. He scanned the tree line, but there was nothing to see. I was so sure she would attack, Laura said, her voice cracking. But she didn't, she just left. She's moving them, Jack. I know she is. We can't call anyone. Not now. Jack didn't argue. His jaw worked, but no words came. Finally, he said, very quietly, the warden is already coming tomorrow. He's on his way. I can't stop that. Laura nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. The truth of it settled over her like ash. That night, the house was quiet. Laura lay in bed, listening for the cubs. They had been noisy every night since they arrived, tiny whines and yips seeping up through the floorboards. But now there was nothing. No sound at all. The silence was deeper than the dark. She shook Jack awake. "Listen," she whispered. He listened. The absence yawned under them like a held breath. The cubs were gone. They did not sleep after discovering the silence. Jack pulled on his jeans and took the big flashlight from the kitchen drawer. Laura followed him onto the porch, her bare feet cold on the old boards. The night was clear, the moon a thin shaving of silver low over the trees. The forest held its breath. Jack knelt by the gap in the lattice and aimed the beam into the hollow. The nest was empty. Only a mat of pressed grass and a few tufts of gray fur remained. No cubs, no movement. The den was a shell. "She moved them," Laura said. Her voice was barely a whisper. "She must have started while we were awake, while we were arguing about the warden." Jack clicked off the flashlight. They stood in the dark, the silence pressing in. "We could have missed it. She could still be coming back for something." They went back inside, but neither returned to the mattress. Instead, they pulled 2 kitchen chairs to the window that faced the tree line. The glass was cold to the touch. They wrapped themselves in the same blanket, shoulders touching, and waited. Time stretched. Laura watched the edge of the forest, the black spaces between the pines. The moon inched higher, casting thin shadows. She thought about the wolf's eyes, the way they had held her without anger. The weight of the secret she had carried was lifting, but something else was settling in its place, an ache she could not name. Relief that the cubs were going somewhere wilder, grief that they were no longer hers to watch over, guilt for every scrap of meat she had pushed through the lattice. "I keep thinking about what Elsie said," Jack murmured, "about the house sitting empty for 3 years. The wolf got used to it, and then we showed up." "We didn't know," Laura said. "Does that matter?" To her. Laura didn't answer. She wasn't sure it did. A shadow detached itself from the tree line. It moved low and fluid, a patch of darkness that resolved into the lean gray shape of the she-wolf. She carried something in her jaws. Laura's fingers tightened on the blanket. The wolf was so quiet. No growl, no panting, just the silent, deliberate pace of a mother doing what mothers do. The wolf crossed the moonlit yard, paused at the porch, and slipped under the gap in the lattice. Laura could not see the hollow from the window, but she could hear the faint rustle of grass, the soft placement of a small body. Then the wolf emerged, empty-mouthed, and vanished back into the trees. "She's doing it," Laura breathed. "She's carrying them one by one. Right now." Jack leaned forward. His earlier anger was gone. In its place was something quieter, something close to awe. "How many trips has she made already?" "We don't know." They watched. Minutes passed. The wolf appeared again, a ghost in the silver light, and retrieved another cub. Then again and again, 5 trips in total. 5 small dark shapes carried gently by the scruff, their legs dangling, their bodies limp with trust. Each time the wolf moved with the same unhurried patience, crossing the open ground as if the house did not exist, as if the 2 faces at the window were not there. Laura watched the last cub disappear into the tree line. The wolf did not look back. The forest swallowed or whole. Jack let out a breath he had been holding for what felt like hours. "That's it," he said. "It's over." Laura nodded, but she could not speak. The ache in her chest had become a clean hollow pain. The cubs were gone. The wolf was gone. The space under the porch was just a space now. They sat at the window until the sky began to pale. Jack got up first. He took the flashlight and went outside. Laura heard his footsteps on the porch, then the creak of the lattice as he pulled a loose board aside. She followed him out, still wrapped in the blanket. Jack was crouched by the hollow, the flashlight beam playing over the empty nest. The grass was flattened into a perfect circle. A single tuft of gray fur clung to a splinter of wood. He picked it up, held it between his thumb and forefinger. "That's all that's left," he said. Laura knelt beside him. The hollow smelled of milk and earth and wildness. She put her hand on the pressed grass. It was still warm. Then, from deep in the national forest, a sound rose into the thinning dark, a single long howl. It was not mournful. It was not a cry. It was a note of pure, settled presence, a declaration that the wolf was exactly where she was supposed to be, with her litter safe at her side. Jack and Laura stood together on the porch, the cold morning air touching their faces. The howl faded, and the forest was still again. They understood without speaking. The chapter was closed. The wolf had made her choice, and they had witnessed it. What remained was the quiet, and the question of what they would do with what they had seen. Officer Daniels arrived just after 9 o'clock. His truck was a battered green pickup with the state conservation logo on the door, and it crunched to a stop in the driveway with an apologetic rattle. He stepped out, a tall man in his 50s with a graying beard and eyes that had the squint of someone who spent his days looking into long distances. He wore a clean uniform, the fabric smelling faintly of pine soap. "Sorry about yesterday," he said, shaking Jack's hand. Axle snapped clean in two. "Roads out here aren't forgiving." He looked around, taking in the porch, the tree line, the quiet house. "I understand you've had some trouble with wolves." Jack led him to the porch. Laura came out with 2 mugs of coffee, steaming in the cool air. Daniels accepted one with a nod of thanks. "Tell me everything," he said, "from the beginning." They told him. Jack started with the discovery of the litter, the tracks, the howls. Laura, her voice low, admitted to the feeding the night she had slipped out, the meat pushed through the gap, the lies she had kept from Jack. She expected judgment, a lecture, maybe a fine. Instead, Daniels listened without interruption, his face calm and unreadable. When they finished, he set his coffee down on the porch railing and crouched by the lattice. He pulled a small camera from his belt and took several photographs of the hollow, the pressed grass, the tuft of fur Jack had left there. "You said 5 cubs?" he asked. "Yes," Laura said. "We counted them the first night." Daniels stood and brushed the dirt from his knees. "And you saw the mother relocate them last night?" "All 5. One by one," Jack said. "Took her about 4 hours." Daniels nodded slowly. He walked to the spot where the yard met the tree line and stood there for a moment, looking into the forest. Then he turned back to them. "I'm going to tell you something that might surprise you," he said. "You got lucky. Very lucky." Laura's throat tightened because she didn't attack, because she didn't see you as a threat. Daniels walked back toward them, his boots crunching on the gravel. "A wolf doesn't court trouble with people. She's got too much to lose. Her litter is everything. If she thought you were a danger, she would have moved those cubs the first night, and she would have done it with teeth if she had to. But she didn't, she stayed." "Because I fed her," Laura said, the guilt sharp in her voice. "Partly, but not in the way you think." Daniels took a sip of his coffee. "Food left out can cause problems. It can teach wolves to associate people with an easy meal, but in this case, she didn't start coming closer because of the meat. She was already watching you before you fed her, wasn't she?" Laura remembered the first night, the eyes at the tree line. Yes, she was curious, assessing. She saw 2 people who kept a strange distance, who made noise during the day, but didn't hunt, didn't set traps, didn't threaten the den directly. The meat was a variable, but it wasn't the deciding factor. What mattered was that you didn't panic and do something rash. You didn't board up the den. You didn't try to drive her off with fire or poison. You just watched. "Jack wanted to call you right away," Laura said. "I stopped him." Daniels looked at Jack. That instinct to wait, it was the right one, even if it came from a complicated place. The mother needed time to find a new den site. If we come in 2 days ago, we might have spooked her into defending the litter. That's when accidents happen. Jack rubbed the back of his neck. "So we just leave it. She's gone. That's it." "She's gone," Daniels said. "She won't come back to den here. This house is too close to her old site. She'll avoid it for a while, but she knows you aren't hunters. Wolves remember." They passed that knowledge on. He looked toward the tree line. "This land is still shared. You'll hear her some nights. You might see tracks, but she won't bring her next litter to this porch. You've been marked as neutral ground." Laura let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Neutral ground. The phrase settled into her like a stone into still water. She had wanted the wolf to be something more, a story, a sign, a secret friend, but the wolf had simply needed a nursery. The house had been empty, the porch secluded. Laura had been a minor, non-threatening presence in the background of the wolf's real life. That was all. Daniels finished his coffee and handed the mug back to Laura. "One thing I'd recommend, leave the porch skirt open. Don't seal it up. Something else might need shelter someday. A fox, a skunk, it's their land too, you're just living on it. He walked back to his truck. Before he climbed in, he paused and looked at them both. You did fine, he said. Better than most. Next time, though, call us before you start leaving out the burger meat. Laura managed a small, watery smile. The truck rattled away down the driveway, the dust settling slowly in its wake. Jack and Laura stood on the porch for a long time, the empty mugs in their hands, the forest quiet around them. The wolf was gone, the den was empty, but the land was still shared, and that was a truth they would carry with them into whatever came next. Summer came and swallowed the edges of everything. The grass around the house grew thick and green, and the forest filled in so completely that the tree line seemed to take a step closer every week. Jack fixed the shutter that had hung by a single nail. He replaced the cracked board on the porch and painted the kitchen walls a pale buttery yellow. The house began to feel less like a shell and more like a home. But the space beneath the porch stayed untouched. Laura noticed it every time she walked past. The lattice still had the gap where she had pushed the meat, where she had knelt and watched the cubs tumble over each other. No one had nailed it shut. Jack had left the planks leaning against the railing until one afternoon he simply carried them to the shed and stacked them against the wall. Neither of them spoke about it. The opening remained, a dark mouth under the floorboards, waiting for nothing. The days were full of small ordinary dangers. A snake in the woodshed, its black body coiled and shining on a stack of old newspapers. Laura found it and called for Jack, who came with a shovel and a cardboard box, and relocated it to the edge of the forest with more gentleness than Laura had expected. A storm in late July brought down a birch tree across the driveway, and they spent 2 days sawing and hauling branches, their muscles aching, their skin bitten by black flies. At night, they collapsed into bed and slept without dreaming. But Laura felt a quiet depression settle over her like a fine dust. It was not the heavy gray weight she had known in the city. It was lighter, more elusive, a sadness that moved at the edges of things. She missed the cubs. She missed the feeling of being watched by something wild, the electric thread that had connected her to the wolf. The forest was still there, full of unseen lives, but none of them seemed to need her. The secret she had carried was gone, and in its place was an absence she could not fill. One afternoon in late August, while Jack was in town buying paint, Laura found herself standing in the kitchen, staring at the floor. The old pine boards were warm under her bare feet, heated by the sun that poured through the window. She knelt and pressed her palm flat against the wood, exactly above the spot where the den had been. The boards were solid and silent. Below them, she knew, was only pressed grass and that single tuft of gray fur Jack had left behind. The warmth of the wood seeped into her hand. It felt empty and somehow impossibly still full. The wildness had never been hers to keep. She understood that now, not just in her mind, but in her body. The wolf had passed through their lives the way a storm passes, unannounced, transformative, and then gone. You could not hold on to it. You could only let it change you and then live with the change. She heard Jack's truck pull into the driveway and stood up, wiping her eyes. That evening, they sat on the porch in the long golden light. A jar of iced tea sweated on the railing between them. The air smelled of cut grass and warm pine. Jack was quiet for a long time, turning something over in his mind. "I've been thinking," he said finally, "about the porch." Laura looked at him. "We could seal it up, put new lattice all the way around, keep everything out," he paused, "or we could leave it, the way it is, open." She waited. "Something else might need it someday," he said. "A fox, maybe, or a skunk, whatever finds its way here." The words settled into the evening air. Laura felt the pressure build behind her eyes. It was such a small thing, a few boards left unnailed, but it meant Jack had been listening. He had heard what Daniel said. He had heard what Laura could not always say out loud. "Leave it open," she said. Her voice cracked on the last word. Jack reached over and took her hand. His palm was rough from the summer's work and warm. She held on and let the tears come, not from sadness, but from a rush of gratitude so sharp it felt like pain. The wolf was gone. The cubs were gone, but the space beneath them would stay, a small dark welcome to whatever came next. On the first cool night of early autumn, when the leaves had just begun to turn and the air carried the scent of wood smoke from a distant chimney, they lay in bed with the windows open. The forest was full of its usual night sounds: crickets, the rustle of small things, the call of an owl. Then, far off, miles away and impossibly familiar, a single howl lifted into the dark. Laura held her breath. Jack's hand found hers under the blanket. The howl rose and fell and faded, and they did not speak. In the dark, Laura smiled. Jack squeezed her hand once and then again. Winter came quietly, the way winter does in Vermont. The first snow fell in November, a dry, powdery dusting that outlined every branch and made the world look drawn in charcoal and chalk. By December, the drifts were knee-deep, and the forest had gone still. The trees stood bare and black, and the sky was a pale, even gray that seemed to press close to the ground. Jack and Laura had learned the rhythms of the house by then. They knew which pipes to rap against the cold, which window needed a new seal, how to bank the wood stove so the embers held through the night. Their lives had become small and quiet, measured in chores and meals, and the slow passage of short days. The fear was gone. In its place was a careful, sober peace. One afternoon in January, Laura walked to the mailbox at the end of the driveway. The cold was dry and sharp, the kind that pinched the skin and turned breath to crystals. She wore the heavy wool coat she had found at a thrift store in town, and her boots left deep, clean prints in the snow. The mailbox was empty except for a flyer, but as she turned to walk back, she saw something that made her stop. A line of tracks crossed the driveway, cutting from the woods on one side to the woods on the other. They were not deer tracks, those were heart-shaped and delicate. These were round and wide, the size of her spread hand, with the marks of claws pressed deep into the crusted snow. Wolf tracks, fresh enough that the edges had not yet softened in the wind. Laura stood still, her breath pluming white. The tracks were not circling, they were not hunting. They were simply passing through, a straight line from one part of the forest to another, as if the driveway was a minor inconvenience on a route that mattered more. She walked back to the house at a normal pace, carrying the flyer in the cold in a strange, quiet elation. Inside, she stamped the snow from her boots and hung her coat by the door. Jack was at the kitchen table, cleaning a rifle he had not fired since they moved. He looked up when she came in. Anything good. Tracks, Laura said. Wolf tracks, across the driveway. Jack set the cleaning rod down. For a moment, his face held the old tension, the shadow of the man who had wanted to board up the porch and call the warden. Then it passed. He nodded slowly. Fresh. This morning, I think. He stood and pulled on his coat. Show me. They walked together to the spot where the tracks crossed the snow. Jack knelt and touched the edge of one print, his bare fingers tracing the ridged impression of the pad. His face was calm. More than calm, it was open, curious. She's still out there, he said. I know. They stood in the cold, the house warm and yellow lit behind them, the forest vast and patient ahead. The tracks continued into the pines, vanishing into the blue shadows of late afternoon. Jack put his arm around Laura's shoulders, and they stayed there until the cold began to bite. That night, after dinner, Laura sat by the wood stove with her sketchbook. She had been drawing the wolf for weeks, trying to capture something true. Not a monster, not a spirit. Just a tired mother with ribs showing under thick gray fur, eyes level and patient, mouth soft around the scruff of a cub. She worked slowly, adding shadows, deepening the lines until the image felt, finally, complete. Jack came in with 2 mugs of tea and sat beside her. He looked at the drawing for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "We had a visitor today." Laura looked up. I know, she's still out there. They drank their tea and watched the fire settle into coals. The camera under the porch was still there. Jack had never removed it. It had become a habit, a quiet witness they sometimes checked out of idle curiosity. The next morning, after breakfast, Jack plugged it into the laptop while Laura washed the dishes. The screen flickered to life, and he scrolled through the footage from the night before. Most of the clips were empty. Wind, a branch moving, the shifting shadow of moonlight. But at 3:47 a.m., the camera had caught something. A lone shape, blurred by the infrared, padded across the frame. It paused at the hollow under the porch, the space that had once held 5 small bodies in a bed of pressed grass. It stood there for a long moment, perfectly still. Then it moved on, disappearing into the dark beyond the lattice. Jack watched the clip twice. Then he called Laura over. She dried her hands on a towel and stood behind his chair, watching the screen. The shape was too blurred to be certain. It could have been a large dog, a coyote, a trick of the light. But the way it paused, the way it lowered its head to the hollow, that was not chance. "Is it her?" Laura asked. "Maybe, maybe not." Jack moved the cursor to the file and hovered over the delete button. He looked up at Laura. She met his eyes and nodded. "We don't need to keep evidence anymore," he said. He clicked delete. The file vanished. The screen was empty. Laura put her hand on his shoulder. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and steady, covering the tracks, covering the driveway, covering everything with a clean white quiet. The house settled around them, full of warmth and wood smoke and the memory of wild things. The land was still shared. The question of wilderness was never fully answered. And that, they had both learned, was exactly how it was supposed to be.